Hi there, I'm Stephanie. Welcome to today's segment on awareness through anatomy. Today we're going to be going over the pelvis, also known as your hip, and how this structure relates to your spine and how we might leverage that relationship to increase control in our spine, core, pelvis, and legs. So first we're going to go over basic anatomy of the pelvis and the bony landmarks. The pelvis is actually made up of three different bones fused together, three different bones on either side. So the first bone that we'll talk about is called the ilium. The ilium is this big flat area here that creates the bowl, kind of the upper lip of the bowl of the pelvis. The top of the pelvis, the top of the ilium is called the iliac crest. So you might be able to feel that if you touch your waistline, and you'll feel this iliac crest. And then two other bony landmarks that are nice to know about your ilium is the ASIS, which is the anterior superior iliac spine. ASIS, this front hip bone, you might be able to feel that on your pelvis as well. And then in the back, we have the PSIS, which is the posterior superior iliac spine, and you may be able to feel that in your back as well, especially if you don't have a lot of fatty tissue in the lower back region or the sacral region. These bones are quite prominent. All right, so we have the ilium. The next we have the pubis, which is sort of this section and above. The pubis involves this front lip and the pubic bone, which you may have heard before. We reference the pubic bone a lot when talking about orientation of the pelvis. And then underneath we have the ischium, and the ischium involves this bottom portion. Between the pubis and the ischium, we have this obturator foramen, which is where a lot of the hip rotators come through, some nerves. So this foramen really just creates this space for structures to flow from the spinal cord, the back of the pelvis. Where is it? Back of the pelvis and the spinal cord. All these nerve roots can exit through here down to your lower extremity. The ischium right here is this bone here. And then we talk a lot about sit bones, or the anatomical term is the ischial tuberosity. So when you're sitting upright, you'll feel these sit bones sitting down on the floor. And if you are sacral sitting or sitting in a posterior pelvic tilt, the sit bones will be sort of forward and you'll be off of them. Okay. So again, the sit bones are another reference point that we talk a lot about when talking about pelvic orientation, either in exercises or just in posture. So being upright on your sit bones versus being sort of back off the sit bones. And then that brings me to this last structure that isn't technically, it's part of the spine, but because it's so intimately related to the pelvis, it's often included in pelvic structure. So this is your sacrum. At the bottom of your sacrum is your coccyx. And collectively together, people often refer to this as your tailbone. So when you're sacral sitting, kind of as I was showing, you're sitting sort of back onto your sacrum here, as opposed to sitting sort of on top of your sit bones and then the tail's kind of floating. And it's important that you try your best to sit in this orientation of your pelvis so that all of the nerves that are coming out through all of these holes, your nerves from your spinal cord will come out through all these holes, that you're not spending too much time in their compression. All right, so you want to make sure that you're sitting as much as you can in this position, so we're keeping those nerves healthy. All right, and then from your sacrum up through the spine, you have your lumbar vertebrae. So your sacrum is this fused sacrum that's really intimately connected to the pelvis through very strong ligaments, and then you have your lumbar vertebrae up on top of that. All right, so now let's talk about the relationship of some of these different structures to both the spine and the femurs. And I'm going to start with the leg bone first. This structure here is the acetabulum. It's the ball and socket joint that connects into your femur. This is not a femur bone. I don't have a femur bone, but I'm going to use it. It's pretty similar. So the femur bone sits in the ball and socket joint just like that, and then your femur bone can roll around in all sorts of different ways. In addition, so this would be if you're sitting and the femur is moving around in space. But let's say, for example, you're kneeling or standing and your femur is fixed on the ground, the pelvis can also move around. All right. So the joint can move with the femur fixed. The femur fixed and the pelvis moving, and the pelvis fixed and the femur moving. All right. That's important to know when programming exercises. Next, we talked a little bit about this already, but we have the lumbar spine on top of the pelvis. And I'm just going to turn the camera to this nice bone structure here. So you can see here that we have the sacrum, the PSIS, and the iliums, and then the spine grows all the way up from there up to the top, okay? So now knowing some of these bony landmarks and a little bit about their relationship with the lumbar spine and the femur, the thigh bone, let's talk a little bit about what that means during exercises. You may have heard in the past about lumbo-pelvic stability. Lumbo-pelvic stability, which basically is just a fancy way of saying, can you keep your lumbar spine and pelvis in stability, so not moving in space, while the femur is moving around in space? Or if the femur is fixed, can you move your lumbar and spine as a unit together through space? So for example, in a hip hinge or a deadlift, okay, or a bridge. So that is the central lumbo-pelvic stability, but let's look at that in terms of what that means in a supine exercise. So if you were in some sort of supine exercise laying on your back, you might have your head over on this end. This is going to be my makeshift spine for today. We have our lumbar spine here. We have the pelvis, if you can see it, and the thigh bone or the femur here. And I'm just going to turn my camera so you can see more of a profile view, and I'm just going to be kind of off to the side. So lumbo-pelvic stability asks us, can we stabilize this orientation, this relationship, as the thigh bone is moving around in space? And when I say moving around in space, that means either passively through like someone else doing range of motion exercises, or actively through your own muscle activation. So one of my favorite ways to train core stability, or lumbo-pelvic stability is the same thing as core stability, is to move clients' legs around in space and say, hey, don't let this area move or change shape. So generally what happens at the beginning is I start moving this leg and the pelvis is kind of moving around all the way with it. There's no control of the pelvis. And then I say, hey, don't let me move your pelvis. Don't let me move you around in space. They tap into their abdominals and they are able to support that relationship, that stability, as I start moving the leg around in space. And that's demonstrating their ability to resist forces happening down here with some stability above. After they're able to control that stability here, then I ask them to actively move their leg while maintaining stability here. If you haven't already created the stability in your lumbo-pelvic joint, what happens is you try to move your body, move your leg into hip flexion, and the pelvis goes into lumbar flexion or starts to roll up. And then if you are looking to go into hip extension, usually what happens is the spine just goes into extension. Okay, so in this position, if you see the leg appears to be moving in space, but really it's not happening here. It's happening here. Okay, so you're training this way of working through leg, quote unquote, leg movements isn't training the hip at all, it's training the spine. Okay, so you want to differentiate those two areas by having lumbo-pelvic stability and then having true hip flexion and true hip extension. I hope you enjoyed this segment of Awareness Through Anatomy, and if you found this information helpful for just your both intellectual understanding and then also application for exercises that you're doing, just give us a like and share with someone that you might find that might find this helpful as well.